Lyn Bryant. In 1998, Lyn Bryant, a mother of two, was planning her 41st birthday celebrations when she tragically passed away. Despite receiving significant media coverage at the time, her case has since faded from public memory. Lyn was described by those who knew her as friendly, outgoing, and family-focused, and she was well-liked and known in her community in Rouen High Lanes, South Cornwall. She had two daughters, Erin, 19, and Lee, 21, the latter of whom had recently given birth to Lyn's first grandchild. The 10-month-old baby was the first of what Lyn had hoped would be more grandchildren. She was eagerly looking forward to watching her family grow. On the morning of Tuesday, October 20th, 1998, Lyn went to work, cleaning a nearby house. After finishing her work, she stopped by her parents' house before heading home. Around 12:45 p.m., Lyn drove her gray Ford Sierra to Harris Garage in Tregony but discovered they were out of fuel. She then went to Chenoweth Garage in Rouen High Lanes, where she purchased milk, gas, and some groceries. While there, a scruffy, white van was seen entering the forecourt, driven by an unidentified man with a beard. Authorities later noted that a similar vehicle had been spotted in the days leading up to Lyn's death, though both the vehicle and driver were unfamiliar to the local community. After visiting the garage, Lyn had lunch with her daughter, Erin. The pair chatted about Lyn's upcoming birthday and watched Emmerdale between 1 and 1:30 p.m. Just after 1:30, the 40-year-old took the family dog, a lurcher named Jay, out for a walk. Her family told authorities that Lyn always took the same route. Several witnesses reported seeing her on her way, and told law enforcement later that nothing seemed amiss. A passing motorist saw Lyn talking to a man at the junction by Rouen High Lanes Methodist Chapel. The man is described as being clean-shaven in his 30s, about 5'9", and wearing light-colored clothing. This is the last known sighting of Lyn alive. At 12:30 p.m., Lyn's body was found by a woman driving up the lane between the chapel and Treviel's Manor. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. Panicked, the woman reversed her car back down the road and alerted a local farmer who recognized the body. While emergency services were called, by the time the air ambulance arrived at 2:50 p.m., Lyn was long dead. She had sustained multiple knife wounds to her neck and back, with the fatal blows striking her in the chest. Authorities noted that the 40-year-old had fought her attacker viciously, and that her clothing was disturbed, which led them to believe she had been the victim of a sexually motivated assault. Law enforcement determined that the murder weapon was a single-edged blade between 10–14 centimeters long. It was likely either a penknife or a small kitchen knife, but so far it has never been located. Despite the fact that police immediately carried out a fingertip search of the area after Lyn's body was found. One interesting clue found at the scene was the vivid blue polyester cotton mixed fibers that were located on Lyn's body. The fibers have never been matched to a specific garment, but are commonly used in both polo shirts and sweatshirts. They are alien to Lyn and her home, leading investigators to conclude that they must have come from the perpetrator. Authorities also stated that due to the struggle and the mud splatter found on the 40-year-old's clothing, they believe the culprit would have mud and blood on their clothing. Another local farmer told the police that he'd seen a man walking across his field between 2:45 and 3 p.m. This was unusual to him because there was no footpath across the area, and it was never used by walkers. He noted that the man wasn't dressed for a walk or a hike, either wearing regular everyday clothing instead. Another bizarre incident that occurred in Lyn's case was that of her tortoise-shell glasses, which she had been wearing when she left the house earlier, but were not found on or with her body. They also did not turn up when the police searched the area. 4 months later, however, on February 2, 1999, the glasses were located sitting on top of the murder at the gateway where the mother of two's body was found. Authorities have been unable to determine where they came from, suspecting that either a member of the public found them or that the perpetrator of the crime had taken them as a trophy, and for some reason, returned them afterwards. The investigation into Lyn's horrific murder was long. 3,144 house-to-house inquiry forms were completed. 1,600 alibis were established. 7,884 statements were taken, and 6,573 vehicles were traced and eliminated. All men between the ages of 1470 who were living in a 1-mile radius of the crime scene were traced, and their alibis checked and cooperated. Due to the remote location of the crime scene, authorities concluded that the culprit was either a local to the area or knew it well. Perhaps they worked nearby or had family who lived in the community. In 2015, investigators who were reviewing the case managed to pull a partial DNA profile from the evidence. Although DNA samples had been taken in 1998, authorities had to begin the process all over again with some 6,000 people in 2016. This was because new legislation which had come into effect 3 years earlier had compelled law enforcement to destroy the old samples. So far, however, these efforts have not led to an arrest or a conviction, although 3 suspects were cleared using the DNA profile. In 2018, on 20th anniversary of Lyn's death, authorities put out a fresh appeal for information which led them to receive 160 calls. 27 new leads involving 13 people came as a result. That same year, a reconstruction of the 40-year-old's last known movement was made and released to the public. The 3 men police wished to speak to have never come forward or been identified. These men include the man seen driving the white car-derived van, the man who spoke with Lyn at the chapel, and the man who was witnessed walking across the field. It's unknown if any of them have anything to do with the crime. In 2016, a former intelligence officer named Chris Clark put forward the theory that Lyn's case is linked with that of Helen Fleet and Kate Bushell. Both women were tragically murdered while out walking their dogs. Kate Bushell, only 14 years old, was discovered dead in Exwick, Exeter, on November 15, 1990. She had been walking a neighbor's dog when she was found with a knife wound to her neck. Helen Fleet, age 66, was beaten to death while walking her dogs on March 28, 1987, in Walbury Woods, Weston-super-Mare. Neither of these cases has been solved, and law enforcement has never officially connected these murders with each other. Lyn Bryant's case also remains unsolved. In December 1998, 300 mourners attended her funeral at Penmount Crematorium in Truro. Crime Stoppers is offering a £10,000 reward for any information that could lead to an arrest. If you have any information about Lyn's or Maureen's cases, you can contact Crime Stoppers anonymously at 0800555111. Moving on to the next case. Maureen Brubaker Farley. Maureen Brubaker Farley was born and raised in Sioux City, Iowa. In 1971, at the age of 17, she moved to Cedar Rapids to be closer to her husband David, who was incarcerated at Anamosa State Penitentiary. Maureen soon found a job at a local diner. On September 17, 1971, she was last seen purchasing a pack of cigarettes. Later that day, Maureen did not pick up her paycheck from work. By September 20th, when she failed to show up for her shift, her employer reported her as missing. 4 days later, on September 24th, 2 teenage boys found her body in a wooded ravine near a landfill. Her body was positioned on top of the trunk of an abandoned junk car. Initially, the boys mistook her for a woman sleeping, but upon returning to the area later, they noticed the discoloration in her body and realized something was wrong. They immediately went home and notified the police. An autopsy revealed that Maureen died from a skull fracture caused by a blow to the head. Investigators determined that she had been moved after her death, with signs suggesting she had been transported to the crime scene after her life had been taken elsewhere. At the crime scene, investigators were also able to collect DNA evidence belonging to the suspect. 6 months after her body was found, Maureen's mother wrote a letter to the Grand Rapids police saying that George Smith was responsible. George worked at the same diner where Maureen worked. He also worked at a liquor store near her apartment. Police interviewed him, but did not have the evidence to charge him, or anyone else for that matter, so the case went cold. Recently in 2021, the Cedar Rapids Police Department Cold Case Unit took another look at the case. They took the DNA found at the crime scene that belonged to the suspect and created a DNA profile. They then tested it to see if it matched the DNA of George Smith, and it did. The only problem was that Jackass passed away in 2013 at the age of 94. Maureen's younger sister, Lisa, said that she felt a lot of emotions, including relief and closure. She also said that she and her family are satisfied with the evidence. Whenever anybody would pass from this world, my mom said, well, now they're up in heaven with Maureen, and they must be happy. And they know the answers. I just didn't want to wait that long. I didn't want us to wait until we go to the next world. I wanted answers in this world. Police Chief Wayne Germain had this to say in a statement: no matter how much time has passed, our officers are committed to seeking out justice for all victims of violent crime as well as their families. I am extremely proud of the generations of Cedar Rapids officers that contributed to bringing this once cold case to a resolution. Maureen's mother Mary, now 86, revealed why she told the investigators back in 1971 that it was George Smith. He apparently asked investigators constantly about updates in the case. His job at the liquor store involved frequent trips to the landfill as part of a hauling service. Mary also shared her thoughts on the fact that he cannot be prosecuted. She said, "We just figure he'll suffer in hell for it. What's done is done, and at least we know it was him, and we can quit wondering. We can let it go." Moving on to the next case. Maureen Dutton. England is known for its understated natural beauty, iconic red telephone boxes, black cabs, and its musical legacy, with successful bands like Oasis and the Beatles. Yet, it is also home to numerous eerie mysteries, including a range of unsolved cold cases that have faded over time. One such mystery is the unsolved murder of Maureen Dutton in 1961, which remains one of Liverpool's most chilling and gruesome cold cases. At just 27 years old, Maureen was a typical English housewife. Her husband, Brian, was a research chemist employed by the Imperial Chemical Industries, ICI. Just 3 weeks before her death, Maureen had given birth to their second child, Andrew, while their first child, a 2-year-old named David, completed their small family. By all accounts, the couple seemed to have a happy and ordinary life, making Maureen's murder all the more disturbing and shocking to their community. On December 21, 1961, Maureen spent the entire day at the couple's home on Thingwall Lane in the Knotty Ash area. She had planned to take David to the nearby Childwall Parish Church but decided against taking her infant son, Andrew, because of the cold and dense fog. Instead, she called her mother-in-law, Elsie, asking if she could babysit later that day. However, Elsie had to cancel when the fog became too thick for her to safely make the trip, and so Maureen's plans were cancelled, leaving her at home with her children. She was last seen alive around 1:30 p.m. that afternoon. When Brian returned home from work just after 6 p.m., he immediately sensed something was wrong. The house, usually filled with the noise of 2 young children, was eerily silent. Maureen was always active, juggling household chores and caring for her boys. His suspicions deepened when he noticed their half-eaten lunch still on the kitchen table. Moving into the living room, Brian made the grim discovery. In the center of the room, Maureen lay lifeless, having been stabbed 14 times in her chest, throat, and back. It is widely believed that her young son, David, who was sitting nearby in a dazed state and staring at his mother, may have witnessed the brutal attack. Andrew, the infant, was found in his crib nearby. The 2 children were presumed to have been left alone for nearly 6 hours. An investigation was immediately launched by the Old Swan police station into the brutal murder of the mother of 2. Authorities believed a long-bladed knife was likely used as the weapon and conducted extensive searches in nearby bushes, shrubs, and drains, but no weapon was ever found. Despite their efforts, no clear forensic evidence was uncovered. There were no signs of sexual assault, forced entry, or anything missing from the home, all of which made it difficult for authorities to pinpoint the motive. After carrying out door-to-door inquiries, police discovered that nobody had been seen coming or going from the home, and nobody had heard screaming or a struggle. Then a young woman came forward with an interesting story. After seeing the newspaper reports of Maureen's death, the young woman who lived in nearby Halewood told authorities that she had been visited by a young man who claimed to be a doctor. Like Maureen, the young woman had recently given birth. She assumed that the doctor had been sent to check on her as part of her postnatal care, but this was not the case. After her husband returned from work, she told him that the doctor had indecently assaulted her, which prompted her husband to make inquiries about the so-called doctor. He was told that there was no doctor operating in the area at that time. The man was described as being between the ages of 27-30, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a dark gray overcoat. On the back of this information, police theorized that Maureen had let the killer into her home under the belief that he was some kind of professional like a doctor or a nurse. Perhaps the 27-year-old had fought back when he tried to sexually assault her, and the culprit flew into a rage and attacked her with a knife. Another strange possible suspect in the case was that of the quote, good-looking stranger. This man was described as being rather young and wearing a leather jacket. He was seen several times in the vicinity of the street on the day of the crime. Witnesses saw him running very fast down the road that afternoon, and not long afterwards, he was seen being violently sick outside of the Court Hay Methodist Church. One onlooker noted that the man kept his hands in his pockets the entire time he was vomiting, which they thought was very peculiar. One woman claimed they'd seen the man on the day of the incident. He had knocked on her door and stood before her clapping his hands. Frightened, the woman slammed the door on him and locked it. By January 17th, the police had gathered over 20,000 statements. With the help of witnesses, they put together a composite image of what they thought the man might have looked like. The Liverpool Echo featured the picture on the front of their paper, and within the first 24 hours of it being published, 60 people contacted authorities with information. However, the names that were given to the police were steadily eliminated, and the man in the leather jacket was never identified. The next suspect in the case was a young blonde woman who was seen acting suspiciously when she boarded a bus close to the crime scene. This unidentified woman boarded the number 10D bus on East Prescott Road. She reportedly had an Irish accent and muttered about how she needed to leave the city immediately. Upon exiting the bus, she repeatedly said, "Oh my God, the woman has never been traced and never come forward." The most bizarre theory to ever be explored in Maureen's case was done so by investigators acting under the orders of Deputy Chief Constable of Liverpool, a man named Herbert Barmer. He theorized that the 27-year-old housewife had been executed in an official killing by a Polynesian cult. Several of the cult's followers were believed to be residing in Liverpool, and it was speculated that they may have been making sacrifices to their god, Tiki, during the winter solstice when Maureen was murdered. The followers were reportedly identified by a tattoo of a reverse swastika. While the deputy chief constable at the time considered this theory, its validity remains uncertain. Eventually, the authorities focused on a suspect, a 24-year-old nurse living on Upper Parliament Street. In 1962, he was arrested and charged for stealing medical equipment and drugs from 3 Liverpool hospitals. He was known to have a reverse swastika tattoo and had even posed as a doctor. However, after further investigation, he was ruled out as a suspect in Maureen's murder, and the theory was discarded. Despite regular reviews of the case and appeals for information, the investigation remains open, though it remains unsolved. If the perpetrator is still alive today, they would likely be in their 70s, making it increasingly unlikely that justice will ever be served. Moving on to the next case. Morris Davis Jr. In Great Falls, Montana, on April 5, 1985, at around 11 p.m., paramedics were called to a home following reports of a multiple shooting. Upon arrival, paramedic Cliff Davies discovered that his 23-year-old brother, Morris Vernon Davies Jr., had been shot more than 8 times and was pronounced dead at the hospital. It seemed that the motive behind the murder was robbery, as the killer had taken Morris's delivery wallet, but left other items untouched. The wallet contained less than $300. For months prior to the murder, Morris had started working as a part-time pizza delivery driver. Since he was the next available driver that night, It appeared that he had not been specifically targeted. A telephone order had been placed at Hauer's Pizza at 8:43 p.m., and Morris left with the food at 9:15 p.m. When he failed to return, another driver was sent to check on him and discovered the tragic scene. Police found that the local home was actually vacant and that the for sale sign at the front of the house had been removed. The back door had been forced open, allowing the killer access to the building. Since there was no phone service in the house, it was likely that the call made to place the order for pizza was done so from a nearby payphone. Authorities theorized that Morris had been killed upon entering the house, but no suspects could be determined until 3 years later. On May 1988, in a town 180 miles from Great Falls, a man was arrested for driving a car stolen from Oregon 3 days prior. When the unidentified thief was searched, it was found that he had 2 receipts from a pawn shop, with one being a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber that murdered Morris Davis Jr. 3 years earlier. After locating the weapon at the pawn shop, authorities discovered that the pistol had also been reported stolen 3 days earlier. Extensive ballistic testing carried out on the gun showed that it was the murder weapon in the case of the pizza delivery driver in 1985. According to the unidentified man who had possession of the gun, he'd stolen it from a friend several days prior to his arrest, and he denied any involvement in the murder of Morris Davis Jr. Not only this, but the real owner of the gun, who went by Rick in articles of the time, also claimed he knew nothing about the murder and that he had an alibi in the form of him being at home on the night of the crime looking after his son. He told police that only he and his wife knew where the gun was kept, and investigators struggled to understand how someone could possibly know where the gun was, take it, and then return it without its owners being any the wiser. Upon investigating the alibi and the background of Rick, police deemed him not a suspect in the 1985 murder. The only other lead in the case comes from Morris's brother Cliff, one of the paramedics who was called into the scene of the shooting. Cliff initially believed that Rick knew who was responsible, but in more advanced ballistic testing was carried out on the pistol, and it was determined that it was not the murder weapon after all. Cliff then came to believe that the prime suspect in the murder of his brother was a man called Donald Debray. Debray had been convicted for the 1986 murder of Suzanne Pritchard, a convenience store clerk who was shot 24 times during a night shift and robbed of $300. Like the murder of Morris, the killing seemed excessive for such a small amount of cash. Cliff Davies contacted Debray multiple times regarding the murder of his brother, alleging that Debray had detailed knowledge of the crime scene, such as the location of the shots fired and where the body was found, among other specifics. Debray reportedly claimed that he was present in the house during the murder but did not pull the trigger. After this information surfaced, police made Debray a prime suspect, but he passed away in prison in 2016 without ever confessing to the murder of Morris. Despite efforts by detectives to bring closure to the Davies family, as of 2020, the murder of Morris Davis Jr. remains unsolved. Moving on to the next case. Siberian Kamerdaiban mountain range tragedy. In August 1993, during the height of summer, 6 spirited and adventurous friends, all passionate about the outdoors and backpacking, set off on a journey most nature enthusiasts could only dream of. However, what began as a relatively simple trek quickly turned tragic when sudden and inexplicable symptoms claimed the lives of 6 out of the 7 hikers. Throughout the 1990s, and even today, though to a lesser extent, groups of tourists from Russia and Ukraine frequently traveled to the Siberian Kamerdaiban mountain range to explore its vast coniferous forests, rich with cedar trees and pristine freshwater lakes. This mountain range encircles the Pearl of Siberia, a lake that contains approximately 20% of the world's fresh surface water, more than the combined volume of all the North American Great Lakes. Even now, thousands of visitors journey to these mountains each year to witness the breathtaking beauty of Siberia's wilderness. The 6 highly capable hikers, all between the ages of 15 and 24, hailed from Petropavlovsk, Russia, and had spent years honing their outdoor survival skills. Despite their youth, all 6 had extensive experience with long-distance hikes and survival expeditions of varying difficulty. Their chosen trek took them through the rugged Compilations Mountains, one of the earliest documented mountain ranges in history, and the world's oldest mapped landmass. Since the range borders Lake Baikal to the south, it boasts stunning landscapes and is uniquely accessible by air travel, allowing more people to explore its rolling hills and towering peaks. However, for this unfortunate group, the adventure would take a horrifying turn as they encountered an unknown and deadly force, one that would ultimately leave only a single survivor. Leading this enthusiastic team of 6 was the highly skilled and respected guide, Lyudmila Ivanovna Korovina. Korovina was remembered as a strikingly beautiful, strong-willed, and athletic woman, a 41-year-old expert survivalist and the head of Azimuth, Petropavlovsk's renowned tourist club, which was part of a larger outdoor education program. Her reputation as a world-class leader and wilderness instructor made her highly sought after, with adventurers traveling great distances for the chance to hike under her guidance. Having trained extensively for years, she was occasionally criticized for her strict survivalist approach, yet former students were willing to travel across the country to learn from her. One of her former hiking team members once remarked, "She knew how to unite people, to create a team. She believed in others. She had a way of bringing out a person's true potential. Under her mentorship, each of us was able to push our limits and grow in every aspect of life." The hikers under Korovina's leadership ranged in age from 15 to 24. The oldest among them was 24-year-old Tatiana Filipenko. Another key member was 23-year-old Alexander Sasha Kresin, who was more than just a student. Many considered him an adopted son to Korovina. The 23-year-old, affectionately called Sasha, a common Russian nickname for Alexander, had been mentored by Korovina for years. More than just a student of her survival techniques, he was a trusted family friend. The rest of the group included 19-year-old Denis Vashin, 17-year-old Valentina Valia Yudichenko, and 16-year-old Victoria Vika Zalasova, the least experienced among them. Vika had participated in previous hiking trips, but not as extensively as the others. She had joined the expedition as a friend of another member, and while Korovina initially hesitated to include her, acknowledging that even Vika's own friends admitted she could be quite vocal in her complaints, she was ultimately invited along. The youngest of the group was 15-year-old Tamir Babanov, who, despite his age, was remarkably skilled in outdoor survival. By the end of the journey, only one of the 7 would survive to recount the terrifying ordeal. Victoria, Denis, Alexander, Tamir, Tatiana, Valentina, and their seasoned leader, Korovina, set out around August 1st, though some reports suggest it may have been August 2nd. Their trek began in the village of Moreno, leading them through the Langutai Gate Gorge. As they progressed, they eventually reached the highest point of their route, ascending Kanilu, the tallest peak in the Compilations range. From there, they began the descent, unaware that their journey was about to take a deadly turn. After crossing the Antigua and Baixa rivers, the group continued their journey toward the Watershed Plateau, reaching this area around August 4th. By this time, they had been trekking for several days, covering an estimated 70 kilometers, roughly 44 miles, through rugged terrain. Their route was classified as a level 3 trek on a scale of 1 to 5, making it challenging but not among the most extreme difficulty levels. Despite the demands of the journey, the hikers took time to forage, gather, and dry golden root, a medicinal plant known for its restorative properties. They eventually reached a summit situated between 2 towering peaks, Faliatsyuginli, which rises to approximately 2,204 meters, and Tiliotranas, standing at about 2,310 meters. At this altitude, the group was nearly 7,545 feet above sea level. However, their chosen campsite raised some questions. They set up camp on a windswept plateau, an exposed and barren ridge offering no natural shelter from the increasingly strong gusts. Those familiar with the region describe this area as almost otherworldly, with a landscape resembling that of Mars. The sloped terrain offered little more than rocks, dry grass, and howling winds, leaving many to question why the group chose this exposed location for their campsite instead of a much safer grove of trees just 4 kilometers, about 2.5 miles, away. This alternative site, situated in a lower forest zone, would have required descending approximately 400 meters, over 1,300 feet, but it would have provided far better protection from the worsening weather. Local rescuers also pointed out another viable option. The hikers could have climbed to the top of the nearest mountain, where an emergency shelter had been constructed specifically for tourists. There, they would have found dry firewood and a designated place to rest, offering them much-needed refuge from the brutal storm that was rapidly closing in. Reaching this emergency shelter would have taken only 30 minutes, yet for reasons unknown to investigators, Korovina did not lead her group there. This decision puzzled many, sparking debate among hindsight critics who questioned why she had not chosen the tree-covered grove instead. Those familiar with Korovina's teaching methods speculated that she may have intentionally picked the exposed ridge as a training exercise, aiming to challenge her team's survival skills in harsh conditions. However, another, more somber theory emerged. Some wondered if the group stopped in this barren, unprotected landscape because any detour, either toward the forest or the shelter, would have taken them off their planned route. Korovina had arranged to meet another hiking group, and deviating from the designated path might have delayed their scheduled rendezvous. Korovina had been managing 2 hiking groups simultaneously, a fairly common practice for extended backpacking expeditions in the region. This particular trek was designed as part of a larger multi-group journey, with the hikers scheduled to rendezvous at predetermined locations along the route. In a tragic twist of fate, the leader of the second group was none other than Korovina's own daughter. Although neither leader carried walkie-talkies, they had arranged to meet at approximately 4 designated points along the trail, believing these intersections would be sufficient to maintain communication in case of any issues. Both mother and daughter were seasoned survivalists, and their plan was to eventually merge their groups and complete the final stretch of the journey together, an unforgettable mother-daughter adventure in the making. However, instead of reuniting with her mother as planned, Korovina's daughter, assuming the worsening weather had disrupted their schedule, continued onward with her own group. After completing the trek, the 16-year-old flew back to her hometown in Kazakhstan, entirely unaware that her mother had died in the very same vicinity, and at the very same time she was hiking. Unlike a steep mountain peak, the area the hikers were traversing was more of a rounded dome, and given that it was summertime, the weather had been forecasted to remain mild. Korovina had carefully studied meteorological reports before the trip, ensuring the group was well prepared for expected conditions. However, on their third day, they were unexpectedly met with freezing rain and light snowfall. What they could not have known was that, on August 3rd, a Mongolian cyclone had swept into the Irkutsk region, an unforeseen weather event that directly contradicted the projections Korovina had relied upon. The formation of the shockingly strong surface winds caused by the passage of the cyclonic cold front took the hikers by surprise, and by nightfall the wind had become terroristic and oppressive in its unyielding nature. Their trek took them on the border of 2 climate zones, the West Siberian Plains and Mongolia to the south of Lake Baikal, and in both zones, the weather phenomenon of cyclogenesis can be created. This summertime event was unexpected based on forecasts, but not rare for the region. Because of the lack of internet technology at the time, the exact temperatures for that day are unknown. While publicly accessible weather histories of the Irkutsk region only go back as far as 1999, a look at the average temperatures historically show no instances of extreme cold in the month of August. Data for the Irkutsk region state that the average low is only 11 degrees Celsius, and the average high is around 21 degrees Celsius. This means that historically the region did not get below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. However warm the temperature was forecasted to be, the group was prepared for rain in general as the region averaged 15 days of rain in the month of August, with Siberia experiencing the most rain in the summer months. So, while the cyclone was unexpected in its ferocity, the group was prepared to encounter rain overall and did indeed have the proper supplies and clothing. At 4 in the morning on August 5th, the seams of the hikers' tents, already tight from being blown in the wind and close to breaking, burst, and while the experienced group fixed what material they could, the wind and dew persisted through the damaged tents, and at 6 a.m., they awoke again to wet sleeping bags and decided to begin their day, as sleep was not going to come with their dampness. At around 11 a.m. on August 5th, a wet and weather-beaten group broke down the already very broken-down campsite and started walking again. Prior to the time that the group was able to pack up and leave, Sasha, the 24-year-old, walked up to one of the tents and complained, presumably to Korovina, of feeling ill. Despite feeling unwell, his symptoms not specified, Sasha decided to press on with the group in hopes of traversing more ground and completing yet another hike. Unfortunately, within the first few kilometers of the group's hike, Sasha started to stumble and fall. Sasha fell multiple times until he became so weak that everyone else in the group had to take on his pack load and help him along. Sasha, the oldest male of the group at age 24 and Korovina's so-called adopted son, then began bleeding from the ears and started foaming at the mouth. Alarmed, Korovina decided to stay back with Sasha and administer aid. She encouraged the remaining two men, one only 15 and the other 19 years old, to lead the rest of the group to the tree line below in order to dry off and hopefully get their firewood to a state that it was able to be burned. However, halfway to the forest's edge, the group turned back. Why specifically is unknown, but it can be assumed that something felt very wrong and the young adults wanted to be close to their leader. One of the group members, Tatiana, brought Korovina a tent in hopes of erecting a temporary shelter from the now roaring storm that had descended upon the valley. When the group looked to Sasha for his condition, they saw his eyes were wide and dark and his pupils dilated. When Tatiana tried to get the now unresponsive Sasha moved under a tent to partially protect him from the oppressive wind, Val tried to help her, but Korovina told them both to stop what they were doing and go straight to the trees and seek shelter. Upon hearing this, Val, 17, grabbed her friend Victoria, 16, to bring her along to the shelter of the forest, but Victoria proceeded to bite Val's hand in response. Shocked but not deterred, Val had to drag the now incomprehensible teen by her hair to the resting point, with Victoria fighting and kicking back most of the way. Val, not yet to the trees because of the now hostile Victoria, turned back around to seek out Korovina, this time to complain that Victoria was not being cooperative in getting to the trees. When Val returned to the group members, she came upon a startling scene. Tatiana was bent double, intentionally banging her own head against the rocks over and over again. Val then looked to Tamir, the 15-year-old, who was grasping at his throat like he couldn't breathe. He soon collapsed. Dennis, the 19-year-old, screamed at Val to grab sleeping supplies and get to the shelter quickly, but when she looked back to reply, she watched him drop the sleeping bag he had just retrieved and fall to the ground, violently writhing and ripping at the clasps of his clothes, just as the other 5 had done. When Val tried to help him, he too fought her off, kicking, adamant in his refusal for her assistance. Bleeding profusely from the ears and foaming at the mouth, 6 of the 7 members of the group had now descended into what could only be described as madness, witnessed only by one unscathed and uncertain 17-year-old. Some of the group members were hiding behind rocks, one had slunk into their sleeping bag panic-stricken, others ran around aimlessly. Val stood helpless as the whole group writhed on the floor, banging their heads against the rocks and the ground and ripping and tearing at their clothes. Some of the members, now in partial states of undress, gradually stopped moving while others continued to shake and move about. Knowing she was incapable of helping more than she already had, Val grabbed enough supplies to temporarily survive the storm and headed to the tree line. There she made enough of an awning underneath the cover of a stone to keep the wind at bay, and eventually she fell into a not-so-restful sleep. The next morning after the storm had passed, Val went back to investigate her group mate's condition. She found that at least 5 of the 6 group members had passed away in the night. She later recalls that upon returning to their bodies, she did not expect anyone to be alive because the symptoms exhibited that night prior seemed fatal, but that she needed both closure and supplies. While some reports say that Val closed each of her fellow friends' eyes, what she actually said became lost in translation in the media, and what she purportedly said according to a local Russian translator was not that she closed their eyes but that she closed or averted her own eyes from the dead. Some sources say that at this point, the morning after the mass psychosis exhibited by the group, that group leader Korovina was still alive and able to feebly give Val directions on how to escape the mountains, but this is not repeated in other sources, so that detail is still in debate. What is known is that the 17-year-old then took a compass, food rations and other survival tools from the back of the deceased group leader and set out to find the Anikta River, a known landmark to the young woman who was now traversing alone. The nearby river was too rough to cross, so Val camped out for the night near an electric tower. When the sun rose the next morning, she saw that there were wires running from the electric tower. Val attempted to find safety in civilization by visually tracing and following the electric cables and wires which brought service to some of the most remote parts of Siberia. But unfortunately the cables just ended at a remote and abandoned town devoid of occupants, food or phone service. Let down by the false promise of hope from the presence of electric wires in a town long abandoned, Val then attempted to follow the water pipes which flowed from the empty village. That led her to a nearby river where she then became so exhausted from her 3-day trek that she stopped to rest, hanging her white t-shirt on the limbs of a tree to dry out. Knowing that she had little food and light warmth for survival, the haggard and weary teenager later recalled that at that point she was preparing herself for death. As luck would have it, tourists from Kiev, Ukraine who were out rafting saw Val on the riverbanks. Initially, they were not alarmed as the 17-year-old made no attempt whatsoever to call out to them and didn't show outward signs of distress. Eventually, the tourists' consciousness got the better of them and they turned around to check on the lone teenager and make sure that she was safe. At this point, logic had come back to Val and she was waving at them furiously. Upon their approach, she rushed at them crying that people were dead and she was scared. She was taken by the concerned tourists to a local hospital and authorities were contacted. After her initial outcry, she clammed up and became almost catatonic once safe in the hospital. This type of reaction is common for someone who has just exerted a high amount of adrenaline for an extended period of time. At the hospital, Val was at first reticent to share her story with the investigators, but eventually some of the details came out, however murky. These details given by Val and the recollections of her rescue and outcry to the tourists were the only ones that the media had access to and some of the only immediate accounts of the incident. For this reason, some details may have been slightly altered or possibly lost in translation. The bodies of the 6 group members had to remain alone for weeks, visited only by scavengers, until August 26th, although some reports say it was 21st, because the mountains were far too windy and dangerous to find and recover the bodies safely. Members of the search and rescue party sent to the scene of the incident by helicopter recall that the bodies were paired off in smaller groups scattered across 40 to 50 meters of ground. The 6 hikers, previously young, strong, virulent, and full of life, were now reduced to bloated and swollen corpses, with death-imprinted grimaces on their faces and in partial states of undress of their many layers, with some only wearing their thin, full-bodied undergarments. 3 of the stricken were without shoes, a fact which lined up with Val's recollection of the hikers desperately ripping off their garments. Workers recall that Korovina was lying on top of Sasha, possibly in one last act of protection. Rescue workers noted that scavengers had consumed the hikers' eyes and tongues, as soft tissues are typically the first to be targeted post-mortem. The deteriorated state of the bodies left few physical clues for forensic examination, and the powerful windstorm that had swept through the area likely erased any non-biological evidence from the scene. The official autopsy reports, conducted in Ulanyud, East Siberia, concluded that all 6 hikers had died from hypothermia. However, this explanation did not sit well with friends and family, who couldn't ignore the glaring inconsistencies in the case. Given the region's typical summer temperature fluctuations, with nighttime lows averaging around 50 degrees Fahrenheit 10 degrees Celsius, the idea that the entire group had simply frozen to death seemed implausible. The most unsettling detail was that a lone survivor, a 17-year-old, neither the largest nor the strongest of the group, managed to endure for 3 more days without any apparent ill effects or cognitive impairment. To those left behind, this scenario seemed highly improbable, leaving them with more questions than answers. Supporters of the hypothermia theory pointed out that the group had been exposed to continuous rain for over 24 hours by the time symptoms began appearing. When combined with wind chill, these conditions could have resulted in extreme cold. Additionally, hypothermia can trigger paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where individuals, in a delusional state, feel overwhelmingly hot despite actually freezing to death. Some believe that the hikers tearing off their clothing supported this explanation. However, beyond this singular detail, the hypothermia theory failed to align with the disturbing symptoms witnessed by Val, the lone survivor. The horrific scenes she described, including foaming at the mouth, profuse bleeding from the ears, and individuals violently smashing their heads against rocks, bore little resemblance to the typical physiological responses associated with hypothermia. Nowhere in any documented cases of hypothermic patients were such antics observed. Quite to the contrary, in fact, people freezing to death often become slower and more lethargic over time, and eventually stop to take their final rest and pass without violent or even visible symptoms. Additionally, while the weather was inclement and stormy, it was still August, summertime. It was not the dead of winter or even in the winter months. Additionally, experts claim that hypothermia being the cause of death does not make sense because that area was not a desert where temperatures can fluctuate rapidly and, as it was August in a forest, the elements, however unyielding, could not have caused such an instantaneous cold with such fatal results. Theories are varied, but with the limited press coverage of this particular incident, and the lack of information from Val, theories are all the families of survivors have to hold on to in hopes of receiving some sort of explanation or closure. Later, in what some would say is victim blaming but others say is just common sense, it is said that in Korovina's insistence that they stay on schedule so as to meet up with her daughter and their hiking group on time and to not miss the allotted intersection window, that she made a rash decision which snowballed into a series of fatal mistakes, which led to the death of her charges. Critics say that her unwillingness to traverse a couple miles out of the way in order to seek shelter in the trees could be reasoned as a major contributing factor to the exposure death. But none of this explains why the group members were foaming at the mouth or bleeding from the ears, as that is not a known symptom of exposure. One theory is that the KGB, the Russian Committee for State Security, was testing some new type of weapon, possibly sound or nuclear-based. Some wonder if this could have been a type of weapon which could incapacitate and cause fatalities from some distance away. There is also speculation that a nerve agent of some sort could have been either knowingly or unknowingly unleashed on the unsuspecting campers, as bleeding from the ears is a common symptom of nerve agents. This theory is fueled by the strangeness of the lack of details and the inconsistencies in official reports and media coverage. This conspiracy speculates that Val, as the only witness to the hypothetical government activities, was paid off, and that is the reasoning behind her decision to move far away and her reluctance to discuss the matter. This type of hypothetical weapon, however, doesn't explain why Val was unharmed in the supposed testing, and this theory is more based on conspiracy rather than any concrete evidence. Some postulate that the group's symptoms could align with the consumption of poison mushrooms or some other food-based toxin. Others wonder if their water was contaminated. Some asked if the stew that they consumed as their last meal contained toxins in some form, but doctors interviewed stressed that due to different body metabolism and different enzymatic reactions, that kind of food-based sickness or poisoning would affect each in a slightly different way and at different times, not so synchronously as Val recalls it. No evidence of a food-based illness existed in the autopsy report, and Val recalls that she and the group members shared all food. In response to the fact that they all shared the same food, those researching the case wonder if Val was protected somehow, perhaps by a secret Korovina was hiding in her rucksack. Some wonder if the sole survivor, Val, may have been the only one to eat the so-called golden root plant that Korovina had been surreptitiously collecting along their trip, an act that possibly protected Val from whatever harm befell the group, be it from a natural or man-made source. Golden root, its scientific name Rhodila rosea, is a perennial that grows in the wild in the mountains of Siberia. The raw roots are said to be limitless in their potential for medicinal use. In the early 50s, Russian scientists classified golden root as a quote adaptogen because it has the potential to create a bodily resistance to certain toxins and supports one's adaptation to various stressors that might befall the taker. The golden root also contains a chemical called sildenafil. Sildenafil is the active ingredient in the ED drug Viagra. For this reason, the root has a high resale value, especially in remote areas without access to prescription drugs. Golden root has an incredibly slow pattern of growth and only has the potential to help people medicinally when fully matured after nearly 12 years of growth. This long growing period and the root's presence in limited regions makes fully grown golden roots highly valuable and sought after. Rescue workers found a bag of these roots, and some say that this amount shows that Korovina took more than needed, ostensibly to sell for profit. While some theorize that the consumption of this root was beneficial to Val and that it possibly saved her life, others wonder if the plant was actually the root of all their problems. Those indigenous to the area believe that the golden root has mystical properties, and Siberian folklore states that those who take more than they need for just personal consumption will be spiritually punished. Due to a lack of access to official statements, it is unknown whether Val actually consumed the roots and if they aided her somehow. Was there another death on the mountain? Did another person die on the mountain with the same symptoms of foaming at the mouth and bleeding from the ears? Some sources report that another fatality may have occurred on the same mountain, but no more information is given, and coverage is not only suspiciously light on the actual group's incident but also in Russian and therefore translated through Google Translate by those who wish to research the incident decades later. Friends of Korovina admit that while Korovina could be extreme in her approach to survivalism, employing tactics that would help the group if they ever encountered an emergency situation, those close to her say that Korovina never took outdoor education to the extreme that her charges would be in danger. A Russian media source initially claimed that the group was food insecure, claiming that the presence of a single soup can and a small tin of meat left at the campsite shows that the group was running on empty, though most unlikely. The medical examiner considered it because of the absence of insulin in post-mortem blood samples of the victims. The only other medical reason that could explain this lack of glucose in the blood of the deceased, however, would be similar to a diabetic-like type of insulin resistance, but how that could have affected an entire group is unknown. The first issue with the theory that the group was experiencing the effects of malnutrition is that the media source was basing their assumptions on the presence, or lack thereof, of food waste at the campsite. But those in the backpacking community understand that the best and most respectful hikers always pack out their trash so as to avoid contaminating the area. And because the scene of the incident was not sealed nor protected from the elements for many weeks, it's possible that scavengers and the weather took what remained of the group's food rations and waste. Moreover, it's only logical to think that even if the group was malnourished, they would have slowly wasted away and would not have gone wild banging their heads against the rocks and bleeding from the ears. No publications on those types of symptoms occurring in the actions of those who have starved to death exist, as mania and orifice bleeding are not symptoms of starvation. For this reason, the theory of malnutrition is not one taken seriously and mostly originated in the original Russian media write-ups that relied heavily on second-hand information of the search group, and not from Val herself. This reliance on second-hand information caused the media to make sweeping assumptions without ever knowing the history of Korovina or her skill sets and methodology. A friend recalls that Korovina was a stickler for survivalist learning, but she was also someone who would have insisted the hikers be nourished before pressing on, and would not have allowed the young hikers to become so malnourished that they encountered death. Many speak of the professionalism of Korovina as she was all about triple-checking the supplies. Val, the survivor of the group, says that they planned to have enough food to consume 2,400 calories a day, and that food was not a factor in their untimely demise. The tallest part of the mountain the group climbed that day reached a peak of 2,396 meters, and when the group stopped to rest they were at 23,100 meters, which is about 7,545 feet above sea level, a high altitude but not one so high that it would cause such extreme illness. For comparison purposes, the lodge at Heavenly in South Lake Tahoe, a common respite for people of all health and ability levels as well as by families with children, has a base altitude of around 2,000 meters 6,000 feet and peaks just above 3,068 meters or around 10,000 feet. This resort and its slopes are enjoyed by those who have driven from San Francisco, a sea-level city, the same day. And while altitude sickness can happen at the resort's highest peaks, it is never as extreme as what the group experienced. Moreover, in the South Lake Tahoe Lodge, at the base level of the resort where the hotel is located, which is an almost exact altitude to what the stricken hikers were experiencing, altitude sickness is almost unheard of, and when it manifests itself, it's usually in the form of a headache or light nausea, remedied often by only water. High-altitude pulmonary edema can cause bleeding from the eyes, but bleeding from the ears is not mentioned in the symptoms. Moreover, high-altitude pulmonary edema or cerebral edema often causes symptoms closer to drunkenness rather than rage, violence, or panic. While the hiker's hometown of Petropavlovsk is only 150 meters, roughly 500 feet, above sea level, the hikers had almost a week to acclimate to the increased altitude, so the claims that they could have been sickened with extreme altitude poisoning is doubted by many. Additionally, altitude sickness affects everybody differently depending on many factors, so the fact that all of the group members went mad and were sickened at relatively the same time is not conducive to altitude sickness. Many believe the lack of correlation with the known symptoms of altitude sickness, and the data of the hikers' trek upwards show that a force other than the altitude was responsible for the death of 6 previously joyous adventurers. What many believe to be the most logical and explanatory theory, while still not completely perfect in its explanation, lies in the hidden and largely untapped power of sound as a weapon. Some wonder if the Mongolian cyclone which overtook the area was actually an anticyclone. Well, a cyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a center of low atmospheric pressure. An anticyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a high atmospheric pressure with varied results. Some theorize that this particular anticyclone caused such an intense wind that magnetic vibrations began to descend upon the hikers, and when combined with the strong air currents, it set in motion a strange and largely obscure phenomenon called infrasound. While sound has been publicly investigated as a weapon of war from as early as 1957, but most likely far before that in sealed military research, this particular instance of infrasound is hypothesized to have been created by the wind, and that the wind created such a low noise that it became unsettling and possibly fatal. According to one article, the large boulders present on the ridge that the hikers stopped to rest on when hit with unusually strong winds at a certain angle can become a quote infrasonic generator of enormous power, which causes a person to experience a state of panic and unaccountable horror. Because airborne sound of sufficient intensity enters the body by direct absorption and in turn stimulates the non-auditory tissue, infrasound can produce physiological effects, essentially similar to a whole-body seizure. This low-frequency noise can be perceived by the brain, but not by the ears on a conscious level. When exposed to these types of sounds, the human body has the potential to react to a noise of which it does not realize it is hearing. Such sensations can trigger overwhelming terror and panic, similar to what Val described witnessing. Experts studying infrasound for military applications suggest that high-intensity acoustic energy can lead to a wide range of effects. It may cause temporary or permanent hearing damage, increased heart rate and blood pressure, as well as physical distress such as pain, vertigo, nausea, and vomiting. Researchers examining infrasound as a potential weapon have identified 7 Hz as the most dangerous frequency for the brain, as it aligns with the median alpha rhythm of human brain activity. This is particularly concerning because 7 Hz is also the resonant frequency of several internal organs, meaning exposure to such sound waves can directly impact the central nervous system. Existing literature on the subject suggests that prolonged exposure to low-frequency acoustic energy can result in severe disorientation, often accompanied by panic and heightened anxiety. Beyond these psychological effects, additional physiological symptoms, including bowel spasms, vomiting, collapsed lungs, and in extreme cases, organ rupture and death, have been documented at frequencies below 7 Hz. Reports indicate that the 6 victims exhibited signs of restlessness, confused speech, anxiety, and disorientation, as noted by Wall. However, one striking inconsistency with the infrasound theory is the presence of ear bleeding among the victims. Moreover, the effects of infrasound at high altitudes remain largely unexplored due to ethical concerns surrounding animal testing and the absence of willing human subjects for experimentation. As a result, gaps in scientific understanding persist, leaving room for the possibility that infrasound may have caused additional, yet unknown, symptoms. Since each human brain and nervous system responds uniquely to external stimuli, not everyone experiences the effects of infrasound in the same manner. This variability could explain why Val remained unaffected while the others succumbed to mysterious symptoms. Factors such as her age, gender, and individual physiological traits may have shielded her from whatever force triggered the others' distress. Because sound waves influence people differently, it is possible that Sasha was the first to fall ill due to heightened sensitivity, perhaps as a result of his age and gender. As the oldest male in the group, he may have been more vulnerable to the frequency, setting off a chain reaction that ultimately led to the group's demise. With no definitive answers, speculation is all that remains of this tragedy. The case is officially closed, with authorities maintaining that hypothermia was the cause of death. However, for the friends and families of the 6 lost hikers, unsettling questions persist. Even after all these years, Val steadfastly refuses to discuss the horrifying events. When approached by reporters for an interview, she once responded sharply, "Do you think I want to relive this nightmare? I had to leave, change my entire life. I don't want to remember it." Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.